And can I welcome the second panel, who are Sarah O'Neill, Head of Policy, Consumer Focus Scotland, and Fiona Farmer, Regional Industrial Officer, Unite Trade Union, Scottish Region. Ladies, can I thank you very much indeed for coming and seeing us today. We will proceed straight to questioning. I'll open the questioning by asking what evidence there is that the bill is necessary and the establishment of alternative business structures will benefit users of legal services in Scotland. Ms Farmer.
We have concerns about the marketisation of this bill, and we have outlined that quite clearly in our written evidence. We're not opposed to change, but we have concerns that opening up the market will result in levels of inequality to justice, which is available to the public and to our members in Scotland. We've seen evidence in England, for example, in the NHS, which has been opened up to privatisation, where you see the most lucrative parts of the service being creamed off and the less attractive parts being left, and problems for those particular sections. We also believe that there could be potential conflicts of interest if this were to go ahead in its present format.
Could you give us some examples of how you feel it could go wrong?
Well, for example, if you looked at privatisation of the NHS in England, what you've seen is what I would say the lucrative and attractive sections being hived off: children's services, acute services, surgery, for example, and other services like care for the elderly and mental health services. They are being left, and they are suffering financially as a result of that, and we would see the same potential detriments happening within legal services if this were to happen. Certain claims and certain areas of justice would be snapped up, and other areas it would become very costly. It would become much more expensive for members to access justice. And we don't believe that access to justice should be dependent on affordability and should be dependent on the depth of your pocket.
Thank you. Ms O'Neill.
Well, Consumer Focus Scotland and our predecessor body, the Scottish Consumer Council, have long argued that there is a need to open up competition in the market for legal services in Scotland and look at new ways of delivering those services, subject to the adequate consumer protections being put in place. And we believe that lifting the existing restrictions through implementing this bill will bring a number of advantages for consumers, including increased choice of services, reduced prices, greater convenience and more consumer-focused services. But most importantly, we see potential for the bill to actually increase access to justice for consumers. And we've been quite concerned that much of the debate so far on the bill has focused on the benefits to big legal firms, external ownership by businesses and on legal markets where there's already fairly healthy competition, such as conveyancing. And we see this bill, together with other proposed reforms, such as those proposed by Lord Gill in his recent Civil Courts Review, as very important in moving forward to achieve modern and consumer-focused legal services in Scotland. And we see this bill having the potential to lead to the development of entirely new structures in the voluntary, charity and advice sectors, not just in private practice, not just the kind of things we've been hearing about, solicitors and accountants and so on. And we think it's important that charitable and advice organisations have flexibility to find ways of addressing unmet legal need, both in geographic areas and in particular areas of legal work, where there's insufficient provision of legal services at present. And that's something that the Legal Markets Research Working Group found in 2006, that there were clear gaps in provision in areas of social welfare law, such as debt, housing, employment and immigration. And we would like to see the market opened up so that CABs, who we know want to have these powers, and other charities can employ solicitors to work directly in these areas.
You had, in fact, slightly anticipated what I was subsequently going to ask, but can I come back to the question which I did ask and basically ask, what is your evidence that this bill is needed?
Well, I think our evidence is, first of all, the research working group report, which I've referred to, which clearly showed that some legal markets were not competitive. There were concerns expressed by advice agencies and others as to a lack of supply in some of the markets which I've mentioned. We also know from other research, such as Path to Justice Scotland, that people can't always access the legal advice and assistance that they need.
Cathy Craigie.
The research working group that you're referring to, when did that carry out its research?
In 2006.
And was that not the working group that concluded that a lot more work was needed to be done in this in terms of research?
Yes.
So I find it strange that you're using that to back up you know, the submission that you've put in there. What drive is there from consumers that this will benefit them?
Well, I think, as others have said, it's very difficult to see what demand there is out there from consumers. What we know is that consumers are not always able to access the legal services that they need at the moment. So while they may not know that they demand other ways of delivering services, we think this bill brings the potential to actually consider other ways of delivering those services which will actually meet people's needs. And particularly, as I said, advice agencies being able to employ solicitors, other possible business structures. You may recall that Ian Smart from the Law Society gave an example of a partnership involving an employment solicitor. I think it was an HR consultant and a management consultant. Now, that solicitor can't practice as a solicitor at the moment, so can't actually represent clients in court, but can represent them in a tribunal. Again, the working group found that employment law was another area where there was a dearth of provision for employees, so it would seem to make sense to allow those kind of structures to grow up. And what we don't know is what other kind of innovative structures might grow up until we actually have these provisions in place.
That's exactly the point I was making. You know, the research working group was made up of, very highly experienced academics and practitioners from across Scotland. Do you not think that it would have been reasonable to follow up with the main recommendation was that there was more work required and more research required, and whether or not this huge change to the way that we deliver law services and solicitor services in Scotland could be made?
Well, we were members, Scottish Consumer Council were members of the research working group, and we very clearly were of the view that the current restrictions should be lifted. I think most of the research which the working group recommended were on things like the taxation process and various other issues. It wasn't really at issue whether there were markets where there wasn't sufficient provision at the moment. I think that was more or less agreed in the report, and that's the evidence that I'm using, I think, here.
I'm sorry I don't have it to hand. I think I do have the recommendation somewhere on my desk, but I don't want to be rude and fumble through papers as we hear your evidence. But the recommendation of that, I don't think that you can pick and choose in terms of recommendations. The recommendations of the working group was that we should have some more research. And what concerns me is that consumers of legal services have not been consulted in any great detail since that review working group that obviously involved yourselves.
Well, I think, as I've said, we do know that there are issues there in terms of unmet legal need. It's perhaps not explicitly, we haven't explicitly asked people whether they would like to have these services, but we think that they would. And we certainly know from the KPMG report that corporate clients seem to be interested in having that because they can see the advantages for themselves. It may well be, we think that individual consumers would see that if they had those things available, but of course they're not repeat players in the same way as businesses. They don't necessarily use legal services very often, so they wouldn't necessarily think about that until they knew what was available to them.
Can I come back perhaps to the first response which you gave, Ms Farmer, where you did express concerns which has been confirmed by the representations that you've already made as to how this might operate, although these particular concerns seem more in connection with the legal aid than the application of the bill. But would it be fair to suggest that you do feel that the operation of the bill could result in a reduction in pro bono services, for example?
I believe that it could. I think it's quite difficult to see exactly how the bill, in many of its ways, could be implemented. And I think we're not opposed generally to the issue of solicitors securing investment and expertise from outside sources. But I think our major concern would be the mass privatisation and how the external providers, multinationals, banks, supermarkets, etc., would be regulated were they to actually start to control the Scottish legal system in that way.
Thank you. We'll now deal with the independence of the legal profession. Stuart Maxwell. Yes,
certainly. Move on to that, if you don't mind. It's just on the analogy